Education, very, very important. And our whole nation has been taken over by secularism and humanism. And that directly affects people who sit under those things. I know that God has key people in those places at times that will be in the midst of that. But it's so important for you as parents to understand where your kids are going, and you make sure that God is directing and guiding you, and that if you have to, you have no choice, that you make sure you oversee that education and not just leave them alone. Very, very important. And Tim's going to be talking about early education in America. Why don't you welcome him again?
As we look at education, and hopefully I can keep you captivated through the food sitting on your stomach now. If you need to take a nap, just don't snore, so that's okay. So in early America, things looked a little different than they do now. One of the things that is a little humorous on some level is a lot of Gen Zers, a lot of millennials, feel like we are now smarter than any generation before us ever in American history. And I think we've confused technology with intelligence, right? Because we have amazing technology, we feel like we're really, really smart people. It's staggering how we have access to an infinite amount of knowledge, and yet we're so dumb as Americans. But this is kind of the culture we live in. So let me back you up. Early America, there were a lot of philosophical objectives, educational objectives we can point to, but there's three things I want to highlight for us now after lunch. Looking at the three objectives, and I'm going to show you all three, then we'll walk through and kind of unfold this. But the first was to teach religion, morality, and knowledge was a primary objective. Secondly, we'll look at teaching thinking skills, which is different than memorizing or learning. Thinking is a different concept. And the last one we will emphasize is to instill high expectations. Every teacher I know today, I was a high school teacher for 6 years. My wife was an elementary school teacher for many years. Every teacher would tell you, we believe the best for our kids, we expect the most from our kids, even as parents, right? We would say, no, I have high expectations for my kids, but that's a relative thought. High compared to what? And so when we're comparing a culture that is down here, sometimes high expectations might be right here, but when you look biblically or historically, we probably got to change some of those expectations. But let me start from the beginning with the teach religion, morality, and knowledge. In education, this was something that was one of the biggest emphasis in early America of anything we could talk about. And you see this all the way from the beginning. If you go back, the first university that survived in America was Harvard. It was named after the Reverend John Harvard. He was one of the elders of the church that helped found the university. It bore his name because he gave his library, so that's where the books came from, so they named it after him in his honor. Nonetheless, Harvard in 1636 was the first school or the first university that survived, and there were many founding fathers who did end up going to Harvard. You have people like John Adams who graduated from Harvard, Samuel Adams graduated from Harvard, John Hancock graduated from Harvard, John Quincy Adams graduated from Harvard. A lot of notable named founding fathers graduated from Harvard. And Harvard, as I mentioned, was one of the schools at the beginning that was founded as a Bible college. Well, actually it was very explicit, because in order to go to a university in early America, you had to pass the entrance exam, which was where you had to be trilingual. You had to be fluent in English, in Latin, and in Greek. But you also had to agree to abide by the school code. So you had essentially a code of conduct that you were going to uphold school standards, and that's what you had to do to go there. Well, here's one of the things that Harvard explained about their school, their policy. They said, let every student be plainly instructed and consider well that the main end of his life and studies is to know God and Jesus Christ, and therefore to lay Christ in the bottom as the only foundation of all sound knowledge and learning. Everyone shall so exercise himself in reading the scriptures twice a day that he shall be ready to give such an account of his proficiency therein. So twice a day, and this is just their expectation, you have to be studying scriptures at least twice a day, but there are founding fathers who actually recall being pulled out of classes and being given quizzes over Bible, books, chapters, verses at Harvard University. So at Harvard, you had to be very familiar with the Bible, was one of their school requirements That was an expectation they had. You have to show you are proficient in your knowledge of the Bible. Another major university was Yale University. Yale produced founding fathers like Noah Webster, who's considered the educator of America. You have people, William Samuel Johnson, who was a signer of the Declaration, Jared Ingersoll, a signer of the Constitution. So some significant founding fathers in the sense of their contributions. Well, Yale also had their own policy statement. So if you wanted to go to Yale, again, you have to agree to follow their standards. Here was one of Yale's standards in the founding era. Seeing God as the giver of all wisdom, every scholar besides private or secret prayer shall be present morning and evening at public prayer. So if you come to Yale, we believe in a lot of prayer, okay, a lot of intercession. So if you're a young person in America, how do you pick the school? Well, do you want to read the Bible a lot or do you want to pray a lot? Because that's Harvard and that's Yale. None of them were secular, right? They might have had a different emphasis, but this is the university culture in early America. Well, then there was other schools like Princeton. At the time, it was called the College of New Jersey, but Princeton produced people like James Madison. Benjamin Rush graduated from Princeton. John Witherspoon actually was a president of Princeton, helped lead it. He was a pastor who was there at the time. Then you have William Patterson, who was a signer of the Constitution. So again, notable founding fathers connected with these institutions. Princeton, their founding motto for school is this, pretty profound founding motto: cursed be all learning that is contrary to the cross of Christ. This is college in America. Now, again, the point we're covering is to teach religion, morality, and knowledge. We believe that was the goal of education, is to teach religion, morality, and knowledge. And you see this at the university level so much that as you go throughout history, in 1860, there were 246 colleges in America. There were only 17 that were not denominationally affiliated. Now, of those 17, that does not mean that they were secular either. Because you have some, like the University of Pennsylvania or University of Virginia, who had multiple chaplains and chaplains of different denominations. Because the majority of schools, you might have had, right, a Methodist school, or you might have had a Congregationalist school, or they were a specific denomination. Well, then there were some that were multi-denominational, but they weren't secular. That is a big majority of schools. Today, if we have a young person who wants to go to college, we have to be very concerned that they're going to get so much indoctrination against faith, against Christianity, against America, right? They might be a very different kid than the one we sent to college. Well, today you have to work really hard to find a school that will not try to take their soul. In early America, you had to try really, really hard to find a school who would not try to reach your soul in a very different way, because we wanted you to know who Jesus was no matter where you went. Today it's a little different. But that was early America because we were emphasizing this notion of faith. 91% of college presidents were pastors in the 1860s. Okay? Now, think how different colleges would be, right? If the local college, your pastor is the president, that college probably looks a little different. Well, this is the way it was in early America. You had pastors who were the presidents of the universities, which is why they emphasized Jesus so much. Well, let's back from colleges up to just more the common man. 1620 is when the Pilgrims arrive in America. You have early settlers and you have more and more colonies that are growing. By 1647, you have the very first educational law that is passed in America. This was first published in what's known as the Code of the 1650s. These are the culminations of all the laws from that surrounding area. And in this, the very first education law was known as the Old Deluder Satan Act. The reason it was called the Old Deluder Satan Act is because that's part of the verbiage in it. But before I show you the law, let me preface with, this is before there is standardized spelling. What that means is you just spell the word however you think it sounds, and it's right. School would have been so much better for me, right? Had spelling not mattered, but here is what the law looks like. So the section on schools, and we've already misspelled it, but forget it, okay? So it says, it being the one chief project of that old deluder, and that's apparently Satan, but it's with a lisp, Satan. So Satan, to keep men from the knowledge of scriptures as in former times, Okay, we can read the whole law, and the whole law is great, but I'm just starting with this premise. They say the devil's main objective is to keep you from what? From the knowledge of the Word of God. So they said, we got to teach our kids to read so they'll always be able to know the Word of God, and that way the devil can't trap them because they don't know the Word of God. That is why public schools started in America. This is the very first education law in America saying we're going to have schools. Now, again, think about how different this is from public school today, right? Where kids are told, oh, no, we can't have religion. You can't pray over your... I mean, all the ridiculous things that are said today to diminish or extinguish Christianity, as opposed to the very reason we have school is so not just you can read, but so you can read your Bible. That's why schools exist. Well, as you keep going, in 1690, they did the very first American textbook. It was known as the New England Primer. It was done all the way through the 1930s. We use this in public schools. And public schools were very different up until the early 1900s in the sense of we didn't used to have grades, we had levels. And this was in first level. Now, the difference between a level and a grade, anybody that's ever played a video game knows the difference between a level and a grade, because the only way you make it to the second level, you had to beat the first level. So grades were a construct that came under the progressive movement. Levels were different because you don't go to level 2 till you've mastered level 1. It doesn't matter how old you are in level 1. You could be 13 or 7 in level 1, and it doesn't matter how long it takes you. Because you could master a level in 2 months or in 3 years, but you could not go to level 2 until you've mastered the content from level 1. This was the book used for level 1. In this book, as you go through, and I'm going to show you pictures from the 1777 version, because this is the one the Founding Fathers printed for their kids. So in 1777, you come to a picture alphabet. On the left, you see the alphabet. On the right, the explanation. Then you see the picture. It says A. In Adam's fall, it looks like finned, but right, it's Old English, so that's sinned. We sinned all. That's a picture of Adam and Eve by a fruit tree and a snake around it. The next one, B. Heaven to find the Bible mind. Okay, that's a man holding a Bible looking up to heaven. C. Christ crucified for sinners died. Down here in the bottom right corner, those are 3 wise men. Above them, that is a stable. It's a star by the stable. It's a cross on a hill. You know, this is pretty religious for just the alphabet. Well, it keeps going. The entire alphabet is from the Bible. In fact, H says, my book and heart must never part. Guess what book is inside of that heart? Psalms 119, thy word have I hidden in my heart. We're showing kids how this works. At the end of this, there was in a section of questions and answers, and the first question at the end of the first alphabet was, who was the first man? Adam. Who was the first woman? Eve. Who was the first murderer? Cain. Who was the first martyr? Abel. It just goes through 25 Bible questions. Then you come to a second alphabet. The second alphabet is known as an alphabet of lessons for youth. A wise son maketh a glad father, but a foolish son is the heaviness of his mother. B, better is a little with the fear of the Lord than great treasure and trouble therewith. C, come unto Christ, all ye that labor and are heavy laden, and he will give you rest. What are those Bible verses? Now, I want you to think about this with me. Why are we emphasizing the Bible so heavily? We're just teaching kids how to read. Why is this all about the Bible? Because what was the whole point of teaching kids to read? Was so they would know what the Bible says. At the end of this primer, now remember, you can't go to level 2 until you pass level 1. At the end of this primer, they have what is known as the Shorter Catechism. Okay, Westminster Shorter Catechism is more than 100 questions on faith and theology that we're asking level 1 students. Now, level 1, we would call that first grade today. So first grade, you're 5, you're 6, you're 7 years old in first grade. Let me show you a few of the questions that these level 1 kids had to know. 36 is one of my favorite from the catechism. What are the benefits which in this life do accompany or flow from justification, adoption, and sanctification? I mean, it's easy stuff, right? Like cat, dog, justification. It's easy. Okay, I went to a Bible college where we discussed that in Bible college. why are you doing this with level 1 students? There's only one reason you would ask these kind of questions, because you want the kids to learn the knowledge of the answer, right? Because we want our students to know, guys, you have been justified through the work of Jesus Christ on the cross. You have been adopted as a child of God into the family of God, and you are being sanctified through the work of the Holy. This is what we're teaching kids, right? Because guess what? After the Q is an A, and that's the answer. So what happens is the kids had to memorize all of the answers to the questions, and the teacher could choose whatever 20, 25, 30 of the catechisms, and the teacher got to pick, and you had to be able to give the answer. And if you couldn't give the answer, you couldn't pass and go to the next level. So you had to memorize everything in this book to be able to pass level 1 and level 2, to make it a level 2. This is where education started in America. Now, I did mention that I'm showing you the 1777 version. We have that version for sale at Wall Builders, which is part of what you're seeing, and it is astounding, the Christian content, but also even the depth of some of the questions that are in there of what we're asking first graders in essence. Well, jump forward. In the Founding Fathers era, George Washington in 1779, so this is during the Revolution, there was a group of Indian chiefs, the Delaware Indian chiefs, that came to him, and they said, we want our kids to go to your schools, because they recognize the advantage if their young people got a better education, that's going to help them more in society and culture. And so they said, we want them to go to your school. And George Washington was very open. He said, but if they're going to come, there's a few things you ought to understand. They are, and these were largely chiefs he was talking to. He says, they're chiefs' kids, but in our schools, we don't have a class system, so everybody gets treated the same. So they won't be the chief's sons in our school. They'll just be students in our school. And as students, he said, here's part of what they will learn. Now, what he told them, he said, Congress will look upon them as their own children. So we're going to treat them just like we treat our kids, but everybody gets treated the same in our schools. He continued, you do well to wish to learn our arts and way of life, and above all, the religion of Jesus Christ. Guess what he said they're going to learn above all in our schools? Right, this is the emphasis of education in America, according to George Washington. Well, he continued in the letter, these will make you a greater and happier people than you are. Congress will do everything they can to assist you in this wise intention. Congress will help get your kids in school where they can learn about Jesus. Okay? It's not where we are anymore, but this is exactly where education used to be. As you go forward, when we move beyond the 13 colonies and now we have more territories that want to enter as states in the Union, this is when we have to do the Northwest Land Ordinance, so we figure out how those territories are becoming states. Under the Northwest Ordinance, it does actually deal with education, and when you look at the section, and this was signed into law by George Washington, when you look at the section on education, what it says is religion, morality, and knowledge being necessary to good government and the happiness of mankind, schools and the means of education shall forever be encouraged. So we encourage schools, why? Because we need religion, morality, and knowledge to have a good government, and this is what we teach in schools, religion, morality, and knowledge, and that order is significant. Because right now, if you talk to teachers, they will say they have a very hard time being able to input knowledge to students because of all the disruptions in class, right? Well, why do we have disruptions? Back up one, because we don't have the right kind of morality in class. Because kids are disrespectful, they don't pay attention, they do their own thing. Well, how do we teach morality? Back up one, you instill religion, right? This was the foundation, and this is why in level 1, we emphasize so strongly Christianity. Because once you have the religious foundation, now you have the morals you need to be able to get the knowledge that will help you be more successful in life. This is a very specific order and sequence that does matter. Today we're trying to impart knowledge without religion and morality. It will not work. All you're doing is educating criminals, right? That's all we're doing, because we're not imparting the value structure that allows them to function in a free society. Nonetheless, this is something that when all these states begin entering the Union, the emphasis of their schools is on religion, morality, and knowledge. This is where we started with education in America. Well, Benjamin Rush is a guy we've talked about some today. He was a signer of the Declaration. he also was one of the guys who started the Sunday school movement in America, which at the time, it was not just to learn more of the Bible. At the time, Sunday school was actually school that was done on Sundays for people who, during the week, the kids are working on the farm. Also, this was something that oftentimes slaves were off on Sundays, and so they could go to school on Sunday, and churches were the ones that really housed these schools, and so you were going to church, but you were getting an education. Anyway, he's the guy that starts a lot of this movement in America. He starts one of the first abolition societies in America. He and Benjamin Franklin joined together to do that. He starts one of the first Bible societies in America. He helped ratify the Constitution, served in the first 3 presidential administrations, so again, really impressive. But serving on the first presidential administrations, at that time, there was not a Department of Education, because we thought education really belonged to the parents and to the local communities. So you need to figure it out on your own locally. States, you take care of your stuff. Communities take care of your stuff, which was a pretty good idea. He recognized, however, that there's something we need to make sure that every state does in unison, or we're going to have problems. And part of what he explained, he wrote many essays, and because of this, he was known as the father of public schools under the Constitution, because as soon as we had the Constitution, he begins writing essays on how schools should work. One of the essays he wrote was in 1790. It's of the mode of education proper in a republic. In this, he explains the way schools should function in America. And part of what he said was the emphasis of the Bible. He said the only foundation for a useful education in a republic is to be laid in religion. Without this, there can be no virtue. Without virtue, there can be no liberty, and liberty is the object in life of all republican governments. This is one of the best arguments anybody can ever present, and a lot of founding fathers made this argument. In a republican government, we believe in freedom, that's liberty, okay? We want everybody to be free. Liberty, make choices. Right? Do what you want to do, but liberty only works if you have virtue. That's morality. Right? And where do we help instill virtue and morality? Well, back up. That's where you have to have religion and education. He said the only way we will function with the liberty that we want in America is if we build it on the foundation of religion, which is where America was so different than France, because France went through a lot of revolutions, and they believed in liberty and fraternity and equality, but they didn't want to have faith be a part of it, and it fell apart for them. Because when you give freedom to immoral people, what do? Look at Chicago on any given weekend, okay? And I don't say that mean. Like, what do you expect a bunch of heathens to do? Be a bunch of heathens. How different would Chicago be if we said, okay, every school, every student is going to have to memorize a few things. Love your neighbor as yourself. Treat other people the way you want to be treated, and thou shalt not murder. If we just started there, I mean, you understand, right? This is where the biggest problems are, and you know, Jesus said that all crime comes out of the heart, right? So if we don't touch the heart, you pass all the laws you want to pass, right? Violent criminals are already breaking the law, that's why they're a violent criminal. Until you reach the heart, which is what we understood, which is what he says, in education, you have to have a foundation of religion. And he explains very well that religion had to be built on the Bible, and it was the religion of Jesus Christ. So that is part of his essay, but this was one essay he did. He then followed up the next year with an essay that was called The Bible in School. So this one is like, you can't confuse anything. He gives more than a dozen reasons why we should never take the Bible out of schools. One of the things he said in closing the essay, he says, if we fail to teach the Bible, I lament that we would waste so much time and money in punishing crimes that could have been prevented had we instructed the pupils in the Bible. Okay? This is the world we live in now. But one of the things he wrote in this essay that I want to highlight for us, he said, the great enemy of the salvation of man, in my opinion, never invented a more effectual means of extinguishing Christianity from the world than by persuading mankind it was improper to read the Bible at schools. This is an interesting argument, right? One of the devil's best strategies in America, now he says, is when people make the argument we shouldn't have the Bible in schools. Now, I think I think it's a very valid argument, but it's interesting. Why could we say it's been so detrimental to take the Bible out of schools? Well, I would point out most of the habits we have as adults, we learned as kids. If you don't make your bed as an adult, it's because you didn't do it as a kid. But you know what? If you don't read your Bible very faithfully as an adult, it's because you probably didn't learn to do it as a kid. You can learn to do the right thing as an adult. Right now, I'm so grateful for the grace, the mercy, the power of the Lord in our life that, yeah, we can change. We can transform. We become a new creation. However, the point remains the same, that if we're not teaching kids to do the right thing when they're kids, why would we expect them to do the right thing when they're adults? This is the premise of his argument. He also continued in this essay, the Bible contains more knowledge necessary to man in his present state than any other book in the world. His argument, which I agree with, is the Bible is the best self-help book you will ever read. Ever. Because it's the most practical, best thing. So let me just give you the thought. Let's say that you are the boss and you want to know, how can I be a better boss? Here's my idea. Read the Bible and then do what it says. If you're an employee, how can I be a better employee? Here's my idea. Read the Bible and do what it says. Right? You're a spouse, how can I be a better spouse? Here's an idea. Read the Bible and do what it says. Right? I mean, we can keep going, but you get the idea, right? This is what he's saying. It contains more practical knowledge than anything you will ever read. You're not going to read a self-help book that's going to do more than what God can show you through his word. And this is what he's making the argument of why we have to have the Bible in schools. The Bible was in schools all the way through the mid-1900s in America. In 1947, this is Dallas High School. Notice that's Bible study course. And the first one's the Old Testament. Well, they also had a New Testament course. This was a required course for graduation in Dallas all the way up through almost the 1970s. You had to take this course to graduate from a Dallas high school, and this was, I'm using Dallas as an example. Many cities had this all the way through the mid-1900s. But in this New Testament, let me just show you a few things they had to do. So this is memorized. They had to memorize this, the pre-existence of Christ. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. All things were made by him. Without him was not anything made that has been made. And the Word was made flesh and dwelt among us. And we beheld his glory and the glory of the only begotten of the Father, full of grace and truth. And that shows you, right? That's John 11, 3, and 14 that you had to memorize. That was every single student at Dallas High School. And it didn't stop there. As you keep going, these are questions they had to learn. So questions on the pre-existence of Christ. Where was Christ before he was born on earth? And it shows you the verses where you can find the answer. What titles does John apply to Christ in this chapter? For what purpose was John sent by God? And then you have the Annunciation, birth, and infancy of Jesus. Name 5 things the angel told Mary concerning the child Jesus. What does the word Jesus mean? How did the angel explain the miraculous births of John and Jesus? On it goes. Every student in Dallas. I don't know that we got into those details in Bible college. And this used to be what every high school student learned. Why? Because the point of education was we were emphasizing religion, morality, and knowledge. And that largely changed because of the U.S. Supreme Court. There was a couple decisions. The first was 1962. It was Engel versus Vitale, where they said that voluntary prayer, or really, I mean, it's teacher-led, but students got to voluntarily participate. But they said prayer was unconstitutional in public schools. And then the following year, there was a dual decision, Abington Ship and Murray Curlett, where the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that the Bible in schools was now unconstitutional. When they made this ruling, they said it was without historical precedent, but it's what the founding fathers intended, and there's a separation of church and state. Now, that's ridiculous on a lot of levels, but when they said the Bible had to be removed, one of the things they explained in their decision, a psychologist had been brought in to testify about the dangers of the Bible, and so when the U.S. Supreme Court said why we could not have the Bible, they quoted the psychologist in their explanation. Here's part of what the U.S. Supreme Court said was the reason we couldn't have the Bible in schools. If portions of the New Testament were read without explanation, they could be and had been psychologically harmful to the child. Okay, so the argument is that if a kid were to read the Bible without an adult to explain it, it might cause brain damage. Okay. I've read the Bible cover to cover many times. In fact, as a kid growing up, our family, we'd read the one-year Bible together every morning. A really cool thing to do. Would totally encourage that for your family. And as I grew older, I got my conviction just on my own that I want to start studying the Bible. So I made a commitment. I'm going to read the Bible cover to cover every year. And I've read that cover to cover every year 12, 15, 20 times. I don't know. I haven't really kept track of it. But I've gone through the Bible a lot. I think it's super interesting. As someone who knows the Bible, it's super interesting that they mention the New Testament as being the problem. Are you familiar with the Old Testament? Right? Because had they said, well, there's portions of the Old Testament I don't think it's good for kids to read, I'd be like, you got a point. Like, there's a few moments, right, where you're like, ooh, yeah, we're going to edit that out for the kids. They said the New Testament. What's the most graphic thing that happens in the New Testament? I would argue it's the crucifixion of the Savior of the world. And they said, well, we can't have kids reading the New Testament without explanation. That might cause brain damage. That's the actual ruling that caused the Bible to be removed from schools. This is where we are today, but this is not where we came from. It's not what we used to be. Our emphasis used to be the point of education is religion, morality, and knowledge. The second emphasis was to teach thinking skills. Now, thinking skills is very different than being a good listener and being a good learner. Thinking is a very different concept. As you look back, one of the books that was used was called The Improvement of the Mind. It was done by Isaac Watts, and the entire book was just designed to make you think. And one of the ways that was used very practically to make people think was we would ask questions to make them defend positions. This was very, very simple, and this was something that one of the founding fathers talked about, some questions that he got asked in one of his classes that he remembered very vividly, and he wrote those down. Here are some of them. Now, on the left, you see it says forensic. Now, there are several things that say forensic, then there's thesis, but forensic is a word that has certainly changed a little meaning over time. I remember when I first saw this, I felt like, well, I know what that is. I've seen NCIS, right? I know what forensic means. It's not really what forensic means. Forensic goes back 1650 in Latin, and it's to learn the art of public argumentation. So it's learning to be a good communicator, but from both sides, knowing how to present this case, why it's good, why that's not good. So if you go back, here's the questions that they were asked. And before we read them, what they would do is they would ask morally ambiguous questions. What that means is that it's not a moral right or wrong. They wouldn't ask, is murder wrong? Well, that's already been revealed in the Word of God. They would ask something that could go, maybe you could argue both sides. You could argue either way on it, such as forensic. Whether the conduct of the patriots who destroyed the tea in Boston Harbor in 1773 is to be condemned. So is that good or bad? But here's what they would do. They would say, okay, you're going to argue in favor, and you have 2 minutes to present your case. And you're going to argue against, you have 2 minutes to present your case. So you'd be put on the spot, and you got to say why it's a good idea. And then you say why it's a bad idea, but it got more interesting. Because then the teacher would say, okay, now switch positions. Because what's happening, you're learning to think through both sides, what's strong, what's weak, what's the best argument, you're learning to think, right? And as you keep going, there's some interesting questions. Forensic, I associate with no one, I employ no one who is not of my party, religion, or politics. Is that good or bad? Well, we know bad company corrupts good morals. If you walk with the wise, you become wise. Your companion fool suffers harms. Yes, but if you never hang out with someone who views something differently than you can argue both sides. This is what they did, but the point was to learn to think through the argument, not just memorize an answer and write it back down on paper. Here's another one. Is there less danger in believing too much or too little? All right? So, teacher picks somebody, you're going to argue in favor, you're going to argue against. This is what he says he remembers doing in his class. Here's another one. Is there more to be gained or lost by a new translation of the scripture for common use? This is still heavily debated today, right? But the point is, you can argue on both sides. And that was what he was explaining, was that when he was in class, he remembers teachers asking them questions and making him defend a side and then making him defend the other side. Why? Because we're learning how to think. We're teaching kids how to use their brain, not just memorize and regurgitate. And this style of learning is something that actually the Bible does teach. A verse that I think we've probably heard before in Proverbs 22:6, it says, train up a child in the way he should go, and when he's old, he will not depart from it. That is something that sometimes the Hebrew doesn't make quite the same level of sense in the English. And we were talking with a friend who's a Jewish rabbi, and he said, yeah, the word in Hebrew is actually closer, because if you think about the word train, there's a lot of different methods and styles of training, right? So what training is the best? He said it's a lot closer to the word catechize, because catechize is a specific teaching method, which catechism was something that was very much what we did in early America. Again, it was a teaching method. And so if you look at early America, this is the catechism of ancient history. And catechism is a way of asking questions and learning the answers. This is a catechism of chemistry and geology. This is a catechism of American law. So catechism is the way we learn this. So it's a catechism, and catechism is questions and answers. And so that's what this was, a catechism of United States history, a catechism of astronomy, a catechism of music. And so again, this is just a style of learning. We did this for basically every topic you can imagine, because this is the style you do it. One of my favorites, this is the catechism of chemistry, but wait for it, this is an elementary catechism of the United States Constitution. So every elementary student was learning the U.S. Constitution in school through this catechism method. Now, a catechism is simply learning to answer the questions related to the topic. So if you're going to do a catechism, let's say, we were going to do a catechism of the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 5 through 7. Of the catechism of the Sermon on the Mount, we would say, okay, well, who delivered the Sermon on the Mount? What did he say? When did he say it? Where did he say it? Why did he say it? And how did he say it? If you can answer every question regarding the Sermon on the Mount, well, then you've mastered the content pretty well. And that was the idea, is you have to be able to answer the questions, not just memorize what was done. Well, why? Well, when? Well, where? And how? This was a teaching method to give us more depth of understanding and knowledge. And questions is something that is still a very good method, but it's also something that's very biblical. If you read the New Testament, and if you look at the questions that Jesus asked, do you know in the four Gospels how many questions appear in the four Gospels from Jesus? There's more than 300 questions. It's also worth noting that Jesus answered very, very few questions because he was trying to make people think. Well, who do you say that I am? Right? I want you to think. You process this. Jesus could have just told them they answered everything. Why did he ask so many questions? Because he was engaging their brain. This very much is a biblical method, and that's what we did in early America for generations. Now, a change did occur. We said, yeah, we don't really like that method anymore, that whole thinking process. We're going to do something different. So, under the progressive movement, what really changed, and under the progressive movement, there's a lot of notable people that were involved: Robert Ingersoll, Francis Wayland Parker, Lester Ward, William Hurd Kilpatrick. The most famous probably is John Dewey, but there was a lot of thought of the problem is that people don't know what we think they need to know. So we're going to change it so that they learn what we think they need to learn. So not thinking, we want them to learn what we want them to know. Okay? This is how indoctrination happens. I want you to learn what I want you to know. And under them, they changed a lot of things. They said, okay, no longer are we going on levels. We now are going to do age-graded education. So you stay with your age, and that way we don't hurt anybody's feelings, right? That way everybody's always along. So it's not about if you've mastered the content. It's not about how much knowledge you have. Now we're going by age. And then they said, well, also, it's probably not good that people can choose to not come to school. We're going to require every kid to come. Why? Because they have to learn what we want them to know. Not think. They have to memorize what we want them to know. And we're going to extend the school year. In early America, do you know how long school lasted? 3 months. It was only in the winter. Why? Because that's when you're not working in the fields, the crops. Because every spring, what do you have to do? You have to help the family plant the crops. Every summer, you're working the farm. Every fall, you harvest the crops. So winter is when you went to school. In 3 months, we used to do more in education than we can do in 9, 10, 11, or even 12 months now. And we did it in less years. But they said, nope, we need kids for longer because they haven't learned everything we want them to know. And then, not only did they say we're going to school for 9 months, we're now going to make you stay past 8 grades or 8 levels. You're now going to go, you know, high school wasn't a thing until the 1920s. Largely 1925 is when high school started. Before that, when you finished your 8th level, you had 2 options. Get a job or go to college. As a 13 to 14-year-old, why not? This would be shocking for many in American culture today, but that's the way it was for hundreds of years. We just thought, no, kids haven't learned everything we want them to know. Anytime that happens, that should scare us a little bit based on who's in charge. But in early America, it used to be you could not graduate unless you could pass an 8th grade exit exam. In the 8th grade, and that was for every state. So to graduate, you had to pass the 8th grade exit exam for that state. We have a lot of early exams from the late 1800s, early 1900s. During the summer, we do a lot of work with college students. And for fun, when we talk about education, I will give them one of the old 8th grade exit exams. I've never had a college student pass one ever. And I've had kids who were in law school, who were in grad school, kids who were, very, very smart kids. Nobody's ever passed one of these tests, but this is how it used to be. In order to graduate, you would have to complete this 8th grade Now, you didn't have to graduate. Benjamin Franklin was an elementary school dropout. What an idiot, that guy. No, he was pretty smart, okay? But it's because once you learned how to think, once you know how to be a learner, you can pick up a book and read and learn and think and process. You can do a good job for yourself. Some of the brightest people I know don't have degrees, but they know how to think really, really well. This was the idea. You don't have to graduate, but if you do, you got to show you've mastered the content, which is why the 8th grade exam. Here's just one. They had 9 sections. Here is one section from 1 year on grammar. How many parts of speech are there? Define each. Define proper noun, common noun, name the proper properties of a noun. What is a personal pronoun? Decline I. What properties have verbs? William struck James. Change the voice of the verb. I can't even read what it says. Objectives, we're going to say, have how many degrees of comparison? Compare good, wise, beautiful. Diagram the Lord loveth a cheerful giver. That was one of 9 sections. That's the grammar section. Okay, if I showed you the civics or the history or the math section, they're, in my estimation, even harder. But every kid had to do this to graduate, or you couldn't graduate. This is not what we do anymore. Today, under the educational system, the U.S. government revealed that we currently graduate 19% of high school seniors who are functionally illiterate and cannot even read their own diploma. We have a broken system that is failing, and there's a reason it's failing, but we don't recognize that, no, we probably should change this system, do something different. This is part of the progressive change that happened. And part of it was because we said we don't want to be thinkers, we want to be learners. Going from a thinking to learning changes a lot of the emphasis, because now it's not about what the student is processing and the questions are being asked. Now, it's no longer about the student, it's about the teacher. Why? Because the teacher is the one that dispenses information. Everybody listen, write this down. It's going to be on your test. It's about what the teacher says, not about a student thinking. Okay? So students just memorize whatever they're told, and they regurgitate. Why in the world do the majority of college students think socialism is the best economic system? The best? No, I'll tell you why. Because their teacher said, write this down, it's going to be on your test. And they don't know how to think, right? This is what we're living in. We had a girl who interned with us this last summer. She texted me. She's at Arizona State University, and she was talking about how her professor, she texted me, she's like, Tim, it's so funny that what we talked about this summer, my professor's doing it right now. And the professor said, well, we know socialism is the best. I want you to write a paper on how good socialism is. And we teach the kids, well, you should ask questions. Anytime somebody makes a statement, the impetus is not on you to prove they are wrong. The impetus is on them to defend their position, because they made the claim, right? So if they say socialism is good, I don't have to prove it's bad. You have to defend the position you just took, that it's good. So we teach them in respectful. I tell kids, always pretend like you're dumb and just trying to learn, right? I have a question, right? So I'm just curious, where has socialism helped a nation become more economically prosperous and brought greater personal freedoms to individuals? Because I like freedom and I like money, and if I'm going to lose both, I probably don't want to go that direction, right? This is the thought, okay? So the student raised the hands and asked the professor, And she says, well, there's really not good examples of socialism because nobody's done it right yet. Okay? Right, so, no, we're not done. So, okay. So what did they do wrong that we need to fix? Well, I mean, it's different in each situation. And here, just read this article. Professor told her, just read this article. She sent me the article, and the article was, nobody's ever done it right. But if you can't pinpoint where it was wrong, how do we fix it? And I will argue the reason it's wrong is because it's built on the goodness of man, not recognizing the depravity of man, that all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. That's why it will never work, because it doesn't recognize what is true in life and reality. Nonetheless, this is something that now students are told, nope, just write it down. And I'm not trying to imply that students are dumb. We have a lot of really good-hearted people who have learned really bad information, right? Millennials get victimized so much. You understand, millennials have some of the biggest motivated hearts. They want to help people. They want to make it. They want a cause to believe in. It's just they've been given awful information, and they don't understand what's true, which is why we have to be ones to help promote what is true. But this is what education has done, going the wrong direction. Okay? Among the progressive system, we introduced some new ideas of testing, such as fill in the blank, true, false, and multiple choice. Do you know none of these require you to think? They only require you to repeat what you heard your teacher say. Okay? Is it true or false that the teacher said this? Fill in the blank the word that is missing from what your teacher said. Circle the one your teacher said is right. None of them require you to think, only to remember what you were told and write it down. Okay? Thinking is not a part of what we do. If you back up to earlier America, there was no such thing as these questions. Everything was written in an essay form where you had to defend your thoughts and your position. You had to be able to explain why you believed what you believed and how it worked. But we now say, thinking is not really a priority. And because of that, we have one of the most gullible generations ever based on some of the things that we are embracing that don't make very much sense. Why? Because indoctrination happened. If we're not teaching people how to think, then they're going to just receive bad information. And even if they have good hearts, they can do some very foolish and damaging things because they don't know what's true and they haven't been taught how to think through what is true. So that is one thing, is we believed in education. No, we want to teach kids to think, to use their minds. A little different than what we do today. In fact, I would even point out that if you go back to World War II, one of the reasons that America had so much success over in the European theater is every time something broke, somebody knew how to fix it. You understand millennials don't know how to change a tire? Like, it's embarrassing. I grew up on a farm, so I am very biased to this. So I've run chainsaws and tractors and my whole life, so I'm very familiar with a lot of these concepts, but I'm also familiar with on the farm, you get the job done. Something breaks, you find a way, you fix, you do. And I'll hang out with some people that are my age, a little younger, and they're just helpless, and I just am ashamed for you, right? But this is where we are today. Why? Because it used to be in previous generations, we taught people to be critical thinkers and problem solvers. And there are exceptions to the rule, because I'm a millennial, but I don't identify with most of my people, okay? So there are exceptions to the rule, which is why parenting becomes even more significant, because parents can overcome a lot of issues in culture that their kids are stuck in. I get it. But this is where statistically the majority of young people, Gen Zers, millennials, are not getting good information. So we're coming to some bad conclusions. We're not being critical thinkers and problem solvers. Last thing I'll point to is the role of education was to instill high expectations. Now, I mentioned everybody thinks, oh no, I expect the best from my kid, or if I'm a teacher, I want the best and I have these high standards. It's only high maybe compared to somebody else we know. Because generally, if you look back in early America, what used to be high standards are so different today. One of our friends is Rabbi Daniel Lappin, really neat guy, and he's helped us understand a lot of things from a Hebrew perspective that does give a lot of context to biblical truth to help us, even as Christians, even though we have disagreements and we've had some funny conversations. Just look, he says, Tim, when we die, if you're wrong, I'm going to speak to God for you. But if I'm wrong, you talk to Jesus for me. So he's not, he's not a Christian, but still has a foundational truth as part of the Judeo-Christian ethic that there's a lot of things we see very similarly from the biblical perspective. One of the things he pointed out, he says, the first time God ever spoke, God could have used any language he wanted. He says, but when God spoke in Hebrew. And Hebrew is a unique language because every single thing has meaning, has significance, every letter, right, every jot, everything means something. He says, and it's not only significant what you can say in Hebrew, it's also interesting what you cannot say in Hebrew. There are certain words that do not exist in the Hebrew language. And my dad and I were together, and when he said that, we thought, okay, like you're baiting the hook, right? Like, okay, so tell us, what are the words you can't say? He said, well, in Hebrew, you can't say words like coincidence. Now, if you think about it for a second, that makes a lot of sense. God wasn't looking down and being like, Adam and Eve met, what a great coincidence. Right? Like, no. If God's in charge, there's not a coincidence. There could be divine moments, there can be divine appointments. There's not a coincidence in that sense. He said, well, also, you can't say the word retirement in Hebrew. You can change your job, but here's the point. Retirement is when we think, now I don't have to work and I can live for myself. Nope, as long as you are here, God wants to use you to do something for somebody else. And when God's done with you, he'll take you home, right? But as long as you are here, God wants you to be productive. Now, if you want to be a missionary on the golf course in your old age, God bless you. Go be a missionary, right? But as long as you are here, but here's the thing. Do you know in the Bible, there's only one example of a rich man retiring? And he had a storehouse. And he built it up. That is great. You fool. Did you not know this very night your soul will be required of you? Yeah, that retirement wasn't something that was supported biblically, but he says that's something you can't say in Hebrew. Also in Hebrew, you can't say the word fair. Is it fair what happened to Job? Is it fair what happened to Uriah? A man who loved God, his wife was taken, he was killed. One of the things, the lessons that my dad taught me when I was growing up, he said, Tim, God is not nearly as concerned with what happens to you as he is with how you respond to what happens to you. Because life isn't going to be fair. It doesn't mean you can respond poorly in those moments. And I can go through dozens of biblical examples. Life isn't always, it wasn't fair for Daniel. It wasn't fair for Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Life isn't fair, but we have this notion today, well, that's not fair. Nope, get over it. Right? This is a reality, but that's not a word you can say in Hebrew. Also, you cannot say the word rights in Hebrew. Now, what he points out is that, he said in America, this doesn't go against God-given rights. He said, but the word in Hebrew would be God-given responsibilities. Because you might have the right of the freedom of speech, but you have the responsibility to speak truthfully. You might have the right of self-defense, but you have the responsibility to not arbitrarily do bad with the weapon you have. What he pointed, and it was very fascinating as he's going through this, like, okay, no, so everything, and then when I can see that for every corresponding right, there would be a responsibility of what God has given us. I totally get that. Well, the last thing he said that's the most interesting for me, at least in the context of today, there's no such word as adolescent. In the Bible, you have children and you have adults. Paul said in 1 Corinthians, when I was a child, I spoke, I reasoned, I thought as a child. When I became a man, I put away childish things. There's no adolescence. See, and even part of Hebrew culture today, you have the bar mitzvah, the bat mitzvah. 13, 14, right? You go from a child to an adult. In America today, we have a different notion of adolescence, right? Oh, they're just kids being kids. Let kids be kids. It's really silly how far we've gone. In fact, just a couple years ago, the government came out and they said the age of adolescence has changed and it's been extended. Well, not only have we extended the age of adolescence, do you know how old, and this is from the federal government. The federal government said the age of adolescence now goes to, it has to be at least 26 because you can be on your parents' insurance up to 26. It didn't stop there. They said, nope, age of adolescence has been prolonged all the way to 35 years old. They gave an explanation. They said because it takes young people until roughly the age of 35, until they have a career, until they have their own place, and until they are in a steady relationship. Here's where the bigger problem is. We are measuring behavior and changing the standard based on behavior. It used to be, you're 13, grow up and get a job. Now we're saying, oh, bless their heart. This poor 29-year-old ain't no poor 29-year-old. This is what we have done. And by the way, this is a very humanistic perspective. It's not a biblical perspective. Okay? But this is where we are in culture today. And because of that, our idea of high expectations is not what it used to be. So, no, I expect the most from people. You don't know what that most means, mostly. Okay? Now, and I'm not saying that for everybody in this room, because some of you are like, nope, I know what it was like. Uphill both ways, snow, barefoot. I know. Okay? But let me just walk you back and give you a few examples. In early America, what we used to do that helped change our idea of expectations, Fisher Ames was a guy who was one of the framers of the Bill of Rights. In fact, he's the guy that wrote the wording to the First Amendment in the House side as they're working to put all this together. Fisher Ames, when he was 12 years old, entered Harvard University as a 12-year-old, which means he passed the entrance exam as a 12-year-old. He was trilingual, fluent in English, Latin, and Greek as a 12-year-old. You then have people like Benjamin Rush. Benjamin Rush, I've mentioned on several levels. Well, he also was a doctor. He was known as Dr. Benjamin Rush. He graduated from Princeton at the age of 14 years old, and then he started his medical profession. Let me just throw out for a second, what would life be like if you showed up to the doctor, and then as 14, you're like, yeah, I'm about to die. It's over, I ain't gonna make it. Benjamin Rush was considered the most famous doctor in American history, okay? He came up with medical cures over 200 years ago that we are still using today. He discovered back in the 1700s that chewing tobacco caused mouth cancer and smoking caused lung cancer. This dude really was brilliant, but he started off as just a kid in the midst of what he did. You have people like John Trumbull. John Trumbull was impressive for a lot of reasons. He served on the state Supreme Court of Connecticut, but when he was 4 years old, he read through the Bible by himself for the first time. Now, that was super impressive to us, but the more we've studied, the more we realize, for example, John Witherspoon, who was a signer of the Declaration, he was a president of Princeton University. He did that when he was 4 years old, read the Bible cover to cover as a 4-year-old, and I'm sure, right, parents are probably helping with some words, but nonetheless, you have a 4-year-old doing this. And it also makes a little more sense if you recognize there's no technology. And so if it's dark at 5:30, what else are we going to do? Well, let's pull out a book and let's get by the fire, get the candle. So this was something that was very much more a part of life than we realized. Nonetheless, he even acknowledged that a lot of other founding fathers were doing the same thing, 4 years old. Well, John Trumbull was then a little different because his father was a very well-educated guy, and so the father, they were doing some homeschooling before they sent him to school, and part of his homeschooling was they were teaching him other languages, Latin and Greek, because they knew he would need to know those going to college. So they started teaching him Latin and Greek as a kid. Well, when he was 6 years old, he apparently was feeling cocky because he challenged his pastor to a Greek contest. Now, to be a pastor, you had to have studied Greek and Hebrew. You had to know this. Well, apparently they were like conjugating verbs or something, and he actually beat his pastor. He did it faster than his pastor in translating from the Greek into English. As a 6-year-old kid, he won the contest. When he was 7.5 years old, he passed the entrance exam into Yale University. As a 7.5-year-old. His dad said, well, let's wait and maybe go with some of your friends when they go, because you'd be lonely by yourself. I mean, clearly the kid's probably not mature enough at 7.5, even though he might have some intellectual capacity, but his dad let him go when he was 11. The average age kids went to college was between 13 and 16 years old back then. Was the average age because that's when you finished level 8, you earned a little money, you had some savings, you would go to college 13 to 16 years old. He passed the entrance exam at 7.5 years old. James Iredell was a signer of the Declaration. James Iredell was put in charge of the finances of his section of the state of North Carolina when he was 17 years old because it was considered he had the best financial and economic mind at the time. Now, I've known a lot of 17-year-olds. Most of them don't even know how to balance a checkbook or know what checks are anymore. That's lost, right? This is a very different thought, but these were young people doing some impressive things. William Livingston, a signer of the Constitution, his family were missionaries to the Indians. When he was 14, he decided he wanted to go off with one of these missionaries on a long-term mission trip, and he went and lived with the Mohawk Indians when he was 14 years old without his parents. He was, and the Mohawks were considered the most savage Indian group in America at the time. He was a very successful missionary to the Indians as a 14-year-old. Now, also just perspective, most parents would not tell their kid, yeah, go live with some savage people group as a missionary at 14. We might not ever see you again. God bless, good luck. That's not normal thoughts today, but back then, as a 14-year-old, he's already finished school, right? He's already moving on with life. Again, we have to change the way we think of what high expectations are. Andrew Jackson, I've mentioned, was not a really good man in some levels, although he was pretty courageous as a military guy in different areas. During the American Revolution and the War of 1812, he actually was a prisoner of war when he was 13 years old. 13 years old, he fought and was captured, had some scars because he was attacked by an officer with a saber, so defended himself more or less, or tried to protect against a slash, cut his hand, cut his face, carried the scars the rest of his life, was a prisoner of war as a 13-year-old. Today, we can't think about the idea of sending a 13-year-old into battle. Nonetheless, it's exactly what he did. You also have examples like Phyllis Wheatley. She was brought to America on a slave ship. She came out of Senegal, Africa. When she got to America, there was a Christian family, not slave people, but they saw this 6-year-old girl about to be sold into slavery. And they said, Dad said, I can't let that happen. So he bought the 6-year-old girl, brought her home, was raised with the Wheatley family. Well, Phyllis Wheatley, at 6 years old, she spoke no English. So Dad tells his daughters, I want you to start training her, help her understand English, culture, education. So they began teaching her not just English, but Latin history, geography, and the Bible. She masters English so well, just her education improved so much that they decided she learned some poetry, and she said, I want to start writing poetry. So she began writing poetry. At the age of 12, her poetry was first published publicly in a paper where they said, this is amazing. Well, in her life, she actually performed before George Washington. She wrote poetry for George Whitefield, some really, really famous people. And this is super significant because not only is she the first African American to be a published poetess, technically she was a slave at the time she did it. And she was someone that the abolition movement pointed to as the reason when some of the arguments of the pro-slavery people were these Africans aren't as smart as the whites. And so they would point to people like her saying, nope, this girl is brilliant. And so she was someone that the abolition or the anti-slavery movement used her as an example. But at 12 years old, she's already doing published poetry. And her poetry was published in a book, very successful. And what happened there, Maria Mitchell was someone who believed that not just men, but all people should be able to learn the wonders of God in the midnight sky. And she's the first woman to ever discover a comet, but she built an observatorium just for women to be able to come and study the wonders of creation. And in this observatorium also includes the telescope that she built. It is still on display. You can see that telescope today. Really remarkable. She is the one that built this. But Maria Mitchell started off at 11. She was a teaching assistant as an 11-year-old. As a 12-year-old, she calculated the time of a forthcoming solar eclipse. I have no idea how to do that, but I'm pretty sure it's hard, right? At the age of 17, she was the principal of a school. 17, and she was the principal. Okay? When we think of high expectations, sometimes we have to change what we think is high because God's given us a lot more capacity than most of us realize, But because we're comparing it to something that's a lot less, we don't realize how much more God's given us the ability to do at times. Two more examples. Louisa May Alcott is someone famous for a multitude of books, but she started very early too. At 9, she wrote her first poetry. At 16, she was the principal of her own school. Okay, really impressive for young people. The last one I will point to is Buffalo Bill. Buffalo Bill, lots of impressive things that he did, but Buffalo Bill at 9 was a cattle herder. At 11 was already out fighting Indians. At 12 was a trapper and woodsman living on his own, doing this as a 12-year-old. At 13, he rode for the Pony Express. At 16, was a military scout, and he's one of the only guys from his era to ever win a Congressional Medal of Honor. And he was a kid when he did almost every single one of those things, which this is where when we start looking at early education and we talk about high expectations, it's a different thought sometimes than what we have today because we believe God's got the best for our kids, but culture has taught us we're a lot dumber than we realize we could be. And this is something as we study history, we realize, nope, there's a lot more capacity God's gifted us with and sometimes we even realize to tap into. Nonetheless, as you look back at early America and education, high expectations, we taught students how to think, and religion, morality, and knowledge were part of the emphasis. There's more things we can add, but that's the idea. And this is something that even as we're having this conversation, it would be fair to say, okay, so what can I do with this? Well, if you're a parent, if you're a grandparent, you can help make up where we know that education is failing right now because you might have kids in public school, you might, and by the way, Christian school, public school, like across the board, all our kids need help wherever they are, but we can be the ones to help be the solution. If there are kids in this church or kids in your church or your small group, wherever you are, we can be ones to help bridge some of that gap. There is so much more we could talk about. As I've already mentioned, we do have a website, wallbuilders.com, lots of resources that we can point you to. And on our website, our catalog, we have a ton of stuff. And I don't say that just because I would like you to buy everything, although that'd be awesome. But the idea is that we feel that God has called us to be the ammunition depot, that God has allowed us to amass a lot of really cool stuff, but we want to help people take this information and go use it how God's called them in their life. And so in your sphere of influence, right, just like Nehemiah rebuilding the wall, in your sphere of influence where you can, we want you to be able to take some of this information and share it with those where God can use you to make a difference. Thank you guys so much for hanging out with us. I know we're going to do Q&A in just a little bit, but it's a pleasure being with you guys.